The Falcons are betting it all on quarterback Michael Penix. And will that bet finally pay off this season?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka the iron that sharpens the iron, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast, and I thank each and every one of you that have been going strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it's available. So today's episode, we are joined by Derrik Klassen of the Athletic Football Show. We'll be talking about Michael Penix, the Falcons draft, and their 2025 outlook. So without further ado, let's get into that conversation with Derrik Klassen right now. Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons, and we are joined by an illustrious guest. He is Derrik Klassen, one half of the Athletic Football Show, of course, with Robert Mays. You can find him multiple times a week on the podcast. You know, it's the summer schedule, so I don't know exactly how often Derrik and Robert will be going all summer long, but always a lot of great insight on that show. And hopefully Derrik will be providing some of that great insight here for Locked On Falcons. Derrik, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. This is always, I feel like this is around the time of year I hop on this show. It's either right before the draft or right after. Obviously last year you guys needed a quarterback, so we did a little bit of a pre-draft and a post-draft, but happy to be here again. This is always a good show. And it's funny you mentioned the cadence of our show during the off season. 4 shows a week, which is, I think it's more than I thought we were going to be doing this off season, but you'll still be hearing from us plenty. So
there you go. Well, let's talk about the quarterback, right? You know, the guy that you had a lot of questions. A lot of people had a lot of questions about last season during this time. That was the selection of Michael Penix for the Atlanta Falcons. You know, Derrik, I'm just curious, after watching Penix's 3 starts, you know, did he answer some of the lingering questions that you had for him? And sort of what is the outlook that you have for Michael Penix as the starter in Atlanta in 2025?
I would say it's still a little bit of a mixed bag for me, but if I had to lean closer to better than I thought or worse than I thought, I would probably lean towards better. I'll start with his best throws are as good as anybody else in the class. I mean, the one obviously he throws down the left sideline that everyone has clipped 100 times already is incredible. But he did make a number of other throws over the course of the season where you see his arm talent really unlock windows that it's hard. Like those are the throws that you need to make as a top level quarterback. So I was impressed by that. The other thing that I was impressed by was I thought coming out of college, he would struggle a little bit more moving off of his spot and like being a ready scrambler. And then I thought his tendency to, okay, if my first thing's not there, I'm going to check it down. I thought that was actually going to be more of a problem for his game coming in than it was. I actually thought he showed pretty good patience about when is the right time to check down, when is not. And then he really was more ready to move as a scrambler than I think he ever was at Washington. And so that to me, when the biggest question was, does he have that creativity, that like second option later in a play? I wasn't sure he had it. And he's never going to be Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, all those guys. But if he can at least get to the bar that, you know, Andy Dalton was at for a lot of his career, I think he could absolutely do that. So I was pleasantly surprised. I still think that there are moments where he gets a little bit too locked onto stuff and he'll throw into windows that he shouldn't. And I still think his touch accuracy in terms of, you know, throwing some of those corner routes, layering some of those seam balls, I think still eludes him at times. But again, given what I thought going in, more good than bad.
Yeah. And, you know, one of the things we've talked about a lot on Locked On Falcons over this offseason is that the Falcons are making a big bet on Michael Penix being the guy. That's been the bet the Falcons have made over and over these last couple of years, is the new quarterback that we have is going to unlock the full version of this Falcons offense, whether we're talking about Desmond Ridder or Kirk Cousins, now Michael Penix, third time's a charm at this point in time. But I'm curious, do you feel like what is sort of for you the ceiling for a Michael Penix-led offense in Atlanta? And do you feel like that's a good bet that the Falcons are making?
I mean, I think the best outcome for them is probably something similar to what like the Titans were with Ryan Tannehill, right? And I think Penix has the potential to be a slightly more dynamic passer than that. Because Tannehill, I do think, was very much like you really had to get him going on, put him in the bumper lanes, just throw a lot of those glance routes and stuff like that. And I do think there's a little bit more dynamism to the way that Penix is willing to attack every single layer of the field. And so maybe you could get something a little better than that, but something in that realm where you want to be more of an under center, deep play action offense where you can attack down the field, really unlock his arm strength. And that, I mean, when they were rolling at their best, and obviously, Bijan's good, but he's not quite like Derrick Henry, so it's a little bit of a different dynamic. But at the peak of those offenses, they were consistently top 5, top 8 units. I think that's possible. I think you're still going to need to see, 2 or 3 levels of development from Michael Penix to really get there. So maybe 2025 isn't the year we see that, but by the end of his rookie contract, I think that's ideally what you're looking for.
Okay. Well, Derrik, appreciate your insight into Michael Penix. I can't have you on this podcast without giving you at least a little bit of runway to talk about your love for Drake London on this show. So if you want to, wax poetic, it's one of the things we've talked about on Locked On Falcons is that given sort of the T. Higgins contract and the Jamar Chase contract, like Drake probably is going to be a $30 million wide receiver next year. And so I imagine you would approve of that type of investment in their Falcons number 1 wide receiver, correct?
Absolutely. And I think what kind of makes him a fascinating player is that a lot of the other top receivers in the league are incredibly explosive players, like the Jamar Chases, the Justin Jeffersons. Garrett Wilson is just an incredibly explosive player. He can make stuff happen. London is a little bit less sexy than that. He's not quite the open field guy that those other players are. But in terms of who is going to, on any given down, move the sticks for me, he might be one of the best players in the league. Like, he is phenomenal at just that, working that 8 to 15 yard range. He's going to catch everything. His ability to sit in zones is phenomenal. He has some of the best ball skills in the league. Like, I know in a league where explosives are so important, people want something else, but he is what an X looks like in the NFL. He's an incredible player.
Yes. And that explosive capability is something I want to see a little bit more, so that I will feel just personally a little bit better about paying a guy $30 million a year, because you want that guy to basically be like, okay, Darnell Mooney's hurt or whoever's hurt, like this guy can be everything that we need in our offense from an engine standpoint. I agree with you. Drake London has more than proven himself to be that guy that, we need a first down. It's 3rd and 7, it's 2nd and 9, whatever it is. He's going to be the guy that can get you that, but also can he generate the explosive plays on a consistent basis? And you saw in that Week 18 game against Carolina where he was just carving up that defense. And so I would like to see a little bit more of that this upcoming season, rather than sort of that one-off to, for me personally, sleep a little bit better about paying a guy $30 million.
And the last thing I'll say about London is, obviously, I think he functions best as an outside receiver, but he's so loose and mobile for a guy who is bigger that some of the slot stuff that Zach Robinson was doing with him last year, I thought was some of the best play calling, design type stuff that we saw from any team all season. It was really, really cool.
Yeah. So those are our thoughts on Michael Penix, Drake London. We'll get Derrick's thoughts on the Falcons draft and sort of the topic that everybody is talking about with the Falcons draft. Was James Pearce worth the trade up, and did the Falcons finally fix their pass rush with 2 edge rushers in round 1? And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So say goodbye to sticky notes, scribbles, plans on the fridge, and overlapping calendar invites. The Skylight Calendar is here to bring you clarity to the chaos and help families stay organized without the stress. The sleek digital display syncs with existing calendars like Google, Apple, Outlook, and more, and it's going to make it easy and simple to track appointments, practices, dinners, and reminders all in one easy to see place. For me, if I don't put something in my calendar, I'm going to completely forget about it. And so whether you're like me and you tend to flake without the help of your calendar, or you're looking for ways to be more organized to get the kids to their activities, or just trying to coordinate a time for your next date night, check out the Skylight Calendar just in time for Mother's Day. Right now, Skylight is offering our listeners $30 off their 15-inch calendars by going to skylightcal.com/NFL. Go to skylightcal.com/NFL for $30 off their 15-inch calendar. That is skylight cal.com/NFL. So a lot of this conversation stems from a conversation that Derrik and Robert had on a recent episode of the Athletic Football Show, their mailbag episode, where they were talking about specifically the Falcons' decision to trade up for James Pearce, as well as, the Falcons betting on 2 undersized edge rushers. We'll circle back to that conversation, but let's get into that conversation about James Pearce in the trade up. As has been discussed on your show and the show as well, it seems like this is the pick that if you like the Falcons draft, you don't mind the Falcons trading up. If you don't like the Falcons draft, you have a very big problem with it. Derrik, I know you've had some of your misgivings with that decision to trade up. Explain for the listeners sort of where you stand on the James Pearce trade up and whether or not it's worth it.
It just not my kind of player is I think the nicest way I could put it. Pearce is one of those guys that he's like 240-ish pounds. And even when you watch him at Tennessee, he's pretty much only winning with speed around the edge, which is a nice trait to have. And guys can absolutely win like that. It's just, to me, the guys who that's their only way to win, that's your Bryce Huffs, your Josh Uches, players of that caliber, your Nick Bonitos at best. And so those can be guys that are getting you 9.5, 10 sacks. But even a guy like Nick Bonito, he's doing that a lot because guys like Zach Allen and DJ Jones are creating so much space for him that his pure speed is allowed to work. I think in the current NFL, you kind of need to win with more than just speed. And a lot of those undersized guys, if you are going to be a little bit undersized, like, Micah Parsons isn't that big. Von Miller at his peak was not very big. Those guys were also pound for pound incredibly strong. And I just didn't quite see that from Pearce. So that's why I struggled with him a little bit. So I actually liked a lot of the other stuff the Falcons did, like Jaylen Walker at 15, I think is totally solid. The double dip at DB, I think was much needed for this secondary. I think as well as I do. And so I liked a lot of the other stuff. It's just, to me, giving that up an extra first-round pick. And I know they did the day 2 shuffling. It was a pretty rich price for a player that I think even without the trade up, I wouldn't have taken until probably the 3rd round.
Fair enough. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I think you and I had a brief discussion on Blue Sky a couple of weeks ago about Jaylen Walker and sort of, expressing some reservations about, him going to a place where he has, I think, a longer runway to development, just because of some of the concerns with Jaylen Walker is, a lot of it may be just his effectiveness at the next level is going to be how he's utilized. I'm curious, do you feel like Atlanta's the right environment for a player like Jaylen Walker? And do you feel more optimistic about his developmental potential with the Falcons than you would in some of these other places?
I think it's actually, for me, less about the Falcons and more just I kind of took myself on a journey with Jaylen Walker. I think when I first was imagining him as a player, just he's a little bit undersized. He's, again, one of those guys who's probably closer to 240. And I think at Georgia was probably playing smaller than that and bulked up a little bit for the combine. And so I just, was he a linebacker? Was he going to be an outside guy? As an outside guy, you see some of the flashes, but he was a little bit underdeveloped as a pass rusher. But the more I thought about it, if my reservations with Pearce are that pound for pound, he's just not very strong, that is not a concern with Jaylen Walker. Jaylen Walker has very long arms, and he will put them into your face mask and just run you into the quarterback. And so the more I thought about it, a guy his size, with his length, with his strength, even if year one, there might be a little bit of, does he have the right moves to work as a pass rusher? Does he have the understanding of, how to mix up against offensive tackles and keep them on their toes? I don't know. But the more I thought about his tools, I'm like, you know what? I could absolutely see him being a guy he's still so young too, that like if he throws on 5 more pounds with his length and strength, I do actually think that he could be a pretty good player. So he was a player I came around on the more the process went on. So I liked him at 15.
Yeah. And you talk about these guys in terms of, having a little bit more power to their game. And that's been something that I've discussed on this podcast. And I know you, Robert, have discussed a lot about sort of, and I think it's easier, particularly when you see the success that a player like Jared Verse had in year one compared to some of the other guys. And then you look at a guy like Chop Robinson, who was probably the second most effective pass rusher. And to me, a big reason for his success last year in Miami was his ability to convert speed to power. And so I'm curious, when we're having these conversations about pass rushers, is it going to be a conversation moving forward where we're talking about guys like Walker and Pearce that are maybe a little undersized, that have a little bit of power to element to the game, but is it enough power to kind of fuel their success at the NFL level? Or are we just sort of going to be moving forward? Are we going to be making better bets? Are we going to feel better about betting on a player like a Shamar Stewart than a James Pearce in the future in terms of evaluating these pass rushers and the speed versus power element?
That's a great question. I don't think so. Personally, I prefer the guys who are the 270s long. I'm of the Dennis Allen school of defensive end. Like I love those guys, but I do think generally it's more, not everybody needs to do that. It's just you have to clear a certain bar. And again, the two guys the Falcons drafted, I think, are a perfect like summation of that. Is like with Pearce, I'm unsure if he clears that bar. Walker, I'm pretty confident he clears that bar. And so those are the guys that it's like, okay, then the speed to power will be good and his bend will be useful and his length will be useful. And so again, not everybody has to be, Carlos Dunlap, but I do think you do have to cross a certain bar, because I think the offensive tackle athletes in the NFL right now are too good to just beat them around the edge. And that's at left tackle. That's probably been true for a very long time, but I think it's becoming more true at right tackle too. I mean, you got the guys like the Brian O'Neills, the Luke Godeckis, Penei Sewell, Lane Johnson. Like there's just too many really good athletes to purely beat them getting around the arc. And so I do think you need a certain level of like, okay, winning with bend and speed might still be my calling card, but I need to just go through the offensive linemen every now and then to keep them on their toes. And so the guys that can clear that bar, they're going to be fine. It's just a matter of, again, I think that's where you need to start trying to calculate how good is this prospect based on like that line.
Yeah, I think that's a excellent point. And when I think about it from the Falcons' perspective, obviously Caleb McGarry has a little vulnerability against speed, so speed looks a little bit more valuable when you're facing him. But I've watched Jake Matthews for almost a dozen years at this point in time, and it's like no one ever really beats Jake with speed, and
you got to go.
It's not as if Jake is a very good left tackle, but it's not as if like he's one of the premier offensive tackles that is like a one-of-one sort of player. And so I do think that is a valuable point, where it's just like the players that give Jake Matthews the most trouble are the Jared Verses, are the guys that will go through his chest. And I think that can be, I think the power element is going to give you more consistency, is sort of where my mindset is going, down to down when it comes to generating that pressure. Maybe that's not going to necessarily lead to you getting a ton of sacks, but in today's NFL, it's kind of just like we got to be disruptive to be productive, right?
That's such a great point, because let's say you have a big 280-pound power rusher versus a 240-pound speed rusher. An okay rep for the 280-pound guy, you're probably still generating some push in the pocket. Maybe if one other thing goes right, you're still making the quarterback uncomfortable. If you're the 245-pound speed rusher and you just have an okay rep around the edge, you're probably just getting ran around the arc, and the quarterback just doesn't even care where you are anymore. And so that's a good point, that even I think that's why we're seeing the shift a little bit more towards the big guys, is that even on not their best reps, you kind of still get something out of it. Whereas those smaller guys, if they get run around the arc, I mean, they're out of the play.
Yeah. So we'll see if the Falcons pass rushers can sort of clear the benchmark to bring enough power, as well as what their speed is going to translate. But I want to get into more of this Falcons draft class, the DBs that the Falcons wound up taking, as well as if you have any sort of lingering thoughts on the Falcons offseason moves as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So with the NBA playoffs in full swing, every night is going to deliver highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. And whether that's the game-winning shot or that breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. And, of course, that means FanDuel, right? They're going to make it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live with their player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have more ways to win than ever before, so that you can win smart and win big. Take the Warriors versus Wolves in this matchup. You can bet on how many games you think the Wolves or Warriors are going to win. Warriors, I got Wolves in 6, and you can have the odds available for the exact order in which those games will go. That's just one of many ways that, of course, you can bet over at FanDuel. So if you're new to FanDuel, make sure you check it out, because it's the perfect time to sign up, because if you head on over to FanDuel.com right now and you place your first $5 bet, you'll get $200 in bonus bets if that first bet wins. So $200 in bonus bets if that first bet wins. So make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. So, Derek, as you mentioned, you're a fan of the Falcons double dipping at the two DBs with Xavier Watts in round 3 and Billy Bowman in round 4. What stood out to you about those two prospects?
I think when you are drafting a guy who's going to be maybe a safety, maybe a nickel for you, you kind of need, there's like a psychopath bar that you have to clear for those type of players to play that position in the NFL, because you're almost a linebacker in a lot of ways. And so I think Bowman absolutely clears that. Again, he's not the biggest guy, but I just loved his mentality. And I think when you are trying to rebuild a defense, those are the types of attitudes that you want to invest in. And then Watts was just a guy where I actually didn't get that deep into the safety class, but he was one of those guys that anytime I put on Notre Dame film for, if I'm watching an offensive player on the other side, whatever it is, it's just like, oh my God, this guy's around the ball all of the time. And this is a defense that did not have guys who were good at being around the ball all of the time. And so I really liked both of those picks. And again, I thought they had some of the worst DB play outside of Terrell and Bates last year. And so them just, again, double dipping at these spots, I think was absolutely necessary. I've still got some questions. Like, I don't think the defensive interior is probably going to be good enough for this team. And I still think the linebackers are a huge question mark, or at least limited players. So I think the middle of their defense is still an issue, but I think they've filled out the outer parts of the defense about as well as they probably could have this offseason.
Yeah. And speaking of those offseason moves, were there any sort of, since we didn't get a chance to talk to you earlier this offseason, any sort of moves that stood out to you in a positive way or a negative way that the Falcons made this offseason that, you're really excited about heading into the 2025 season, or, still having major questions about?
I think with them kind of being a little bit limited on some of their resources, I knew they weren't going to do a whole lot. And so to me, it was just like, how far can they fix the defense? Because I think we both knew they weren't really going to touch the offense. They didn't really need to. Got a lot of good players over there, and they already have their quarterback. So to me, it was just, how far are they going to fix the defense? And again, I love the double dipping at safety or at DB. And honestly, I like the idea of double dipping at edge. It's again, with Pearce in particular, I just kind of quibbled with how much I loved that player, but I really like the double dipping there. Again, I think if they had the resources for it, one more player in the middle, whether it would have been defensive line, which I think they probably needed. And I know they signed Morgan Fox, but that is more of a, rotational. We just hope this guy can give us a few good snaps rather than, I think, like a linchpin type player. And then again, linebackers, I think, really up in the air. Like Troy Anderson and Divine Diablo, who they signed, are both more like, not really linebackers and just fast guys you throw at the problem, which can be useful. But, I think they probably need a little bit more than that. And then Ellis, to me, is more of a replacement level player. So again, one more guy in the middle of the defense, I think, would have made me get to like a 9 out of 10 with some of what they did. But otherwise, I still think it was a pretty successful offseason.
Yeah. Well, the idea of what the Atlanta Falcons are doing always sounds better than the actual reality of what the Atlanta Falcons are doing. So hopefully this year, this is the year where the execution, lives up to the potential of the idea. And so, I being bullish on the Atlanta Falcons at this stage in the offseason, it feels like old hat at this point in time, just because the last couple of off seasons, it's been like, okay, this is the year where the Atlanta Falcons make the push for the NFC South, and we get to like week 8 and they're in first place, and it's like, oh, this bet is about to pay off, and then it completely falls apart. My hope for this team this year is that in the past, where we've had, Desmond Ridder and Kirk Cousins kind of the wheels fall off the track in the second half of the season, because Michael Penix is so young and still developing as a quarterback, that we'll actually see his best version of football in the second half. And that will at least allow the Falcons that, should they be leading the NFC South midway through the season, that they will actually finish strong for once in the NFL. Do you feel like I have any hope for that reality coming true?
So I what I will say is that I don't think the wheels will fall off for Penix. Like, I just think he is wired in the right way, where it seemed like Ridder, it seemed like things were just kind of moving too fast for him, all that jazz. And then Kirk, I think, is obviously wired the right way, but he just health-wise didn't have it last year. And I don't think either of those are going to be an issue for Penix. So what the ceiling is going to be, who knows? Again, I think he still needs to fix some of his touch accuracy. I think some of his pocket movement can be up and down, but in terms of the wheels not falling off and him just being an adult at quarterback, I do think that he'll at least cross that bar. And they've got enough explosive players that he doesn't even have to do a lot of the heavy lifting, right? Like, we already waxed poetic about Drake London, but I think Mooney was surprisingly good for them last year. And then you have, I don't know, the third best running back in the league, fourth best running back in the league. And that certainly goes a long way.
Yeah. Well, we'll see if the Falcons actually live up to the hype this year. You know, one of these years they got to break through. So why not this year? That's basically becoming my motto. It's like, why not 2025? Yeah, sure. So Derrik, I appreciate you coming on, joining and sharing your insights into not only Michael Penix, Drake London, the Falcons offseason moves, and their draft picks. Let the people know where they can find some of your other stuff and some of the things you're working on.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me again. This is always a fantastic show to do. You guys can find me on Twitter or Blue Sky at QB Class. It's up there on the screen if you're watching on YouTube. And that's about it. We're pretty much, like I said, for the podcast this offseason, it's going to be a lot of episodes. It's going to be like 3 or 4 a week. I'm going to be hosting an episode here soon because Robert's going to be away. So it's, the next month or so of the show is going to be pretty jam-packed.
Okay. So we're going to get the substitute teacher. So
yes, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, we'll see if the kids act up. So, Derrik, always appreciate you coming on, sharing your insights, and look forward to, maybe getting you on closer to the season to see what's what, where the Falcons are looking as we specifically head into the 2025 season, as opposed to projecting it 3 months out. But really appreciate you coming on and sharing your insights.
Of course. Thanks again.
Okay, guys, that is going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. Thank Derrik Klassen again for his insights into this and a lot of the topics that we sort of talked about with Derrik. Could have been entire podcasts in their entirety. And there's a good chance that as we fill the time between now and training camp, that we will do deeper looks into some of these topics, such as the power element in terms of evaluating pass rushers. I know certainly when we talk about Jaylen Walker and James Pearce, when we do their in-depth breakdowns on this pod and have other people come on and share their insights into this pod, we'll probably explore that. And of course, we got a lot of pumping to do this summer. And that Penix pumping is going to be going so hard. We're all just gonna be locked in, looking at each other's in the eyes, just pumping away. So, piggybacking on some of the things Derrik said about that, we'll explore that further. Of course, we'll get more insights into the rest of the draft and the Falcons' upcoming season. So a lot of things that we sort of dance around. This is the appetizer, before we get to the entree with some of these topics. So appreciate Derrik for allowing us to explore some of those things. Maybe not as in-depth as we would ideally like, but certainly touching upon a lot of, smart football topics that, the ball knowers. So that's what the stuff that we're talking about. So whether you believe in the hype or you don't believe in the hype with the Atlanta Falcons, either way, it makes for a lot of great conversation. So that is going to do it for today's conversation here on the podcast. Tomorrow, we will probably be getting more into the defense with Cody Alexander of matchquarters.com. Get some insight into what went wrong with the Falcons defense last year, what could go right with the Falcons defense this upcoming season. So all that is in store for you on tomorrow's Locked On Falcons. So continue to make us your first listen. Continue to be an everydayer by checking us out, subscribing, following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, for your second listen of the show, of course, Locked On Podcast Network has you covered, but why not check out the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast with Joe Marino, Kyle Krabs, giving you the scoop on how to build your roster the correct way over at Locked On NFL Scouting. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.